Oddly enough, survivors of near-death experiences relate astonishingly similar journeys after they're reported clinically dead. They tell of seeing their bodies from high above as medical doctors work to save their lives. In the darkness that follows, they encounter a long passageway or tunnel, at the end of which there is a brilliant light. They hear beautiful music, the sound of wind rushing past them, and they feel an otherworldly sense of peace. Dr. Raymond Moody, considered the father of the near-death experience phenomenon since his groundbreaking book, Life After Life, was published in 1970, tells of yet another striking similarity to the near-death experience.
Very often in these experiences, they encounter a divine or angelic being, and this being, in effect, may give them a choice. You can either go back to the life that you have been leading, or you can come on in this experience that you're having now. It's interesting that they all say that from their own personal perspective, they would rather have stayed. They would rather have remained with this wonderful light and love. But they choose to go back typically, almost universally, because they have young children left to raise.
Such was the case for Robert Turner, an architect and marathon runner who met his guardian angel after entering a Massachusetts emergency room, dead on arrival.
It happened on the hottest day of the year, July the 20th, 1970, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I believe the official temperature that day was 98 degrees. The race started at 2:15 in the afternoon. And for the first half a mile, I led a blistering pace. I knew I was in trouble. My mouth was so dry, there was no moisture in it. I stopped perspiring, and I can remember running on the street, and pretty soon most of the runners disappeared. About that time, I blacked out, and I continued the balance of the race almost totally unconscious.
Robert collapsed at the finish line, at the feet of his wife and 2 small children. He was carried to a nearby car and rushed to a local hospital. And despite the efforts of a police officer to revive him, Robert had no pulse.
I knew he was dead. I heard them say his heart had stopped. And when he went into the hospital itself, into the emergency room, he was not breathing at that time.
I looked at the heart monitor and saw it zero out. And I knew my heart had stopped and I had probably died. I felt a total, absolute oneness, which I've never experienced before, of being with everybody in that room. Everybody in the universe I was part of. And I went on this glorious trip with my angel, who had always been with me and always walked on my left side. And I knew his name was Joseph.
While Robert's body lay in a coma in the hospital, his spirit walked in a beautiful wooded forest filled with radiant light. It was there that he encountered his guardian angel.
And he told me to stay where I was, and he walked over to this group, and they started talking, and they all looked back at me. And I knew they were talking about me. And then my angel Joseph came back and told me that I had a mission. It was not my time, and that he had to take me back.
17 hours later, Robert woke from his coma. But it would be years before he would have the courage to tell his wife about his amazing journey and how he was forever transformed by his near-death experience.
He has slowed down. He used to be on the corporate ladder, and he has slowed down. And we do stop to smell the roses, something we never used to do.
Report that their angels actually gave them a choice of whether to go with them or not. A dramatic example of this was the case of Dr. Ron Kennedy, a San Francisco physician who survived a brutal knife attack in which he was stabbed more than 13 times. Dr. Kennedy was returning home from giving a lecture overseas to find his friend and house sitter sitting on the stairs in a psychotic state.
I saw sitting on the stairs there's my friend Abdul, who had been house setting for me, during that week I was gone. and I noticed that he was beating sweat across his brow. And I said, how are you? Well, at that moment in time, he screamed at the top of his lungs, incredibly loud, and I hadn't noticed that he had a steel tennis racket in his right hand. And then there's a break in my memory, and I don't remember anything until, I guess a few moments later, waking up on the floor. And then I noticed that he was swinging what turned out to be a dagger. And it appeared to me that I really didn't have a chance, that he had gained the upper hand, and that I was going to die. And as I looked over his shoulder, I could see a kind of hallway. And you know, I don't have a hallway in that part of my house. And at that moment, time stopped. Where the hallway had been, there appeared a light. And then it began to take on the characteristics of a kind of personality. And then it gave me a question. And it shot a question. I have to say it this way, it shot a question into me, like an arrow into my chest, not with words, but with just the heart of the thought itself. And the question was, will you come now or later? And I wanted to know what might be next. And on the other hand, I could see aspects of my life which were just clearly unfinished. I had a 3-year-old son at that time. I was full of his spirit. It was his presence which really made the decision. It was, heck no, I'm not leaving this now. I'm not finished. And so I gave the answer back, like, directly as the question was given to me. I stayed.
It was 10 years before Dr. Kennedy was able to speak about his near-death experience and to then be able to understand what he had seen and felt.
After this, it occurred to me that the love from this light was so overwhelming that this life must have something to do about learning love like that, learning to love like that, or learning, perhaps even more to the point, learning to be loved like that, to actually experience the love that people have for us.
Ron's story has been used by counselors to give comfort to families of murder victims who feared their loved ones died alone and in pain.
If this light could appear to me in these circumstances, and I was being murdered, and yet I was not going to die alone, that was plain. And I was going to die in a sea of enormous love. And so, if I had anything to say to people, I guess it would be, those people you love who have died, and maybe in the most extreme circumstances. If my experience is any indication, those people did not die alone, as you would fear that they did. They died with great love around them.
Explain a spontaneous cure. Many people believe that angels come to those who are sick and dying to save a life or perform a miracle.
In January of 1981, my husband, Chris Deal, was diagnosed with acute lymphatic leukemia. Chris had just gone through a series of chemotherapy that pretty much wiped him out. He could not walk alone. He was not eating at all. He was sleeping 24 hours a day. Unless you physically came and moved him or woke him up, it was pretty obvious that he was losing the battle.
Melissa always slept on a cot just inches away from Chris's bedside. On January 4th, at 3 in the morning, Melissa was awakened by a nurse. Chris was missing.
I was panicked. None of it made sense. He can't walk. How did he get away? How did he get around me? Where did he go? Why don't the nurses know what's going on?
Then Melissa noticed a glow through a doorway at the end of the hall. She opened the door to find Chris. And in the corner of the room was a strange figure.
His skin was so white, it was almost transparent. I couldn't believe the color of his eyes. They were ice blue. He looked like a youth, like a teenager, but there was something, some wisdom about him. I realized that he had on a flannel shirt, he had on Levi's, and he had on lace workup boots. Now, Chris was a musician, and this was an attire that he wore a lot. I think in an odd way, he was trying to dress to make Chris feel comfortable.
Melissa realized that Chris wanted to spend a few minutes alone. She returned to the room. Soon, Chris returned, and she asked him who the stranger was.
I'll never forget the look on his face. It was like, you're not going to believe what I'm getting ready to tell you, look. And he said he was an angel. He said he was his guardian angel.
After the visit with the angel, Chris was rejuvenated. He was healthier and happier than he had been in many months.
He was smiling, he was eating, he was visiting patients in other rooms on the ward. He had this unbelievable energy. There is a sense about him that has totally changed. When I had seen him before he went to bed, this was a man carrying around a weight of a terminal illness. And then the man that came in the room was like the young, healthy man that I had married. It was different. He had changed.
The next 2 days were filled with joy, but on the third day, Chris lost his battle. He passed away peacefully with Melissa at his side. This angel had not come to heal his physical body.
Most people think that with sightings or coming of angels, they just take for granted that if they've got an illness, they're going to be healed. And this was a miracle of a different kind. And I believe that though Chris didn't physically, his physical body didn't survive, his spiritual body was healed. And whatever journey or adventure that he was on the threshold, I think he really went into it whole and strong and ready for it.
It might help explain throughout